Hi, my name is Diego Guerra. My mandatory pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with the National Deaf Center on Postsecondary Outcomes, abbreviated as NDC. NDC is a technical assistance and dissemination center funded by the Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, and Rehabilitation Services Administration, RSA. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to share. If you're using a smartphone, I encourage you to transition to a computer or a tablet. And the reason for that is because cell phones or mobile devices tend to have a limited display of about 4 screens. And today's session will be using 5 screens. And again, just checking, make sure that our captions are working and the voicing is working. We do have interpreters providing voice interpreting for folks using spoken English. So the presentation will be in American Sign Language, but we will also have voice interpretation. We are also trying something new, as you can see with our captions today. We'll be asking for feedback when we send a follow-up after the panel. Again, keep in mind it's something new and we're trying to improve the experience for folks who have to watch captions on Zoom and via a live webinar like today. We will also have a couple polls and you'll see those pop up. There'll be questions that you can respond to so that we can get a sense of who is in our audience today. Feel free to respond regardless of who you are. We're very curious if you're connecting with your local community and the impacts you have experienced after COVID-19. Also, we do have a limited amount of time together, so we are going to try our best to save some time for your questions. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please type in your questions into the Q&A box. You should see that at the bottom of the Zoom software. Also, if you see a question, we will be reading the questions in American Sign Language. If you would like to sign your question via video, that will be allowed. Just make sure you indicate that to us. Now that I've taken care of the housekeeping list, I'd like to go ahead and start our program. Welcome to our panel, For Deaf People by Deaf People, Centering Deaf People in Systems Change. Now, you might be wondering how to sign Centering Deaf People in Systems Change, and I've signed it a couple of different ways here. There are a variety of ways to sign that, and I think it's a discussion that definitely needs to be had with more folks. So I'd like to ask our panelists to now join us on screen. Please open up your video windows. I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. These are amazing people that we've had the pleasure of working with at NDC. We've partnered along with them in their communities. And Julie, tell us a bit about who you are, what your passions are, and what you do.
Hi, yes, this is Julie. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm an ASL specialist at the Deaf School for the entire statewide program for students who are mainstreamed. My passion is to go out into the woods, go camping, meet people, and just really get a sense of how our community can be the best that we can be.
Julie, thank you so much for that introduction. Kyle Rosenberg.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm in Delaware, outside of Philadelphia. I'm a community member involved with youth leadership, community development, and partnerships, and a camp director, team building facilitator, and a whole host of different things. And that is my passion. Just like Julie, love to be out in the woods and get out and retreat. And it's disappointing it's going to be cooler soon, so I won't be able to camp nearly as much, but I love it.
Kyle, thank you so much for that. And I agree with you. Dominic? person says, "Hi, I'm Dominic. My name sign is DG, and I'm out of Philadelphia, born and raised. I currently work in supporting clients who are looking for employment throughout various programs where we provide those community services in New Jersey. And my passion really is investing in our deaf youth and making progress there. That's where my passion lies from day one. I also have a deaf mentorship program, and it exists to serve that purpose. And this is Diego. Thank you, Dominic. Folks, thank you for briefly introducing yourselves. We are eager to get the program going. We do have questions that we'd like to ask. But before we get going, I had mentioned we had partnered with these individuals. We have a program at NDC called Engage for Change. At NDC, we believe that we need to center deaf people. We need to listen to the deaf knowledge, deaf experience, and how they've been able to navigate through barriers and challenges, systemic barriers and challenges that they may have faced. And we've had thousands of conversations with people across the country. And we've noticed that over the last 4 years, and it's hard to believe that it's been 4 years already, a similar trope continues to arise. And that's that deaf people need to be involved in the decision making. Deaf people need to be a part of the process. Rather than asking deaf folks what's needed and then moving forward without their input. So today we're going to have a conversation on what centering deaf people in systemic change looks like. So I'm ready to ask our first question to you panelists, and we'll poll the audience and see your response as well. You should see a poll question that'll populate on the screen. And the first question says, since the pandemic in March, do you still feel like you're connected to your local community? And so if we can open up the poll, please. Okay, we can close the poll and show the results. Wow, I see a lot of responses, 52% in the somewhat category. Okay, 90%, 9%, excuse me, responded yes, and we have 35% responding no, and 4 saying not sure, but the highest response there is 52% at somewhat. And we have 71 people reporting that they feel that way. Folks, thank you for your responses. And I agree, everyone's world is upside down since the pandemic hit. A lot of priorities have changed. A lot of things that we were used to on a daily basis have also changed. I mean, from A to Z, the changes have been complete. So my question to each of you, as part of your community members and part of that community project, what did you learn from being involved with the Engage for Change local program? What are your main takeaways? Julie, yes.
Sure. For me, there were two big takeaways. When we first hosted the meeting, we were inviting specific people who had some buy in power, so to speak. We brought them in, but the deaf community members, we also brought them in, brought everyone together. It was very interesting because the people with the, as we say, the buy in power, it was their first time. They were super engaging with the deaf people and had this great event. It didn't feel like a meeting, it was more of a social engagement. And we noticed that they just don't know what they don't know. And so many of them had some aha moments during that time. They didn't realize so many systemic barriers that the deaf community experiences. And so the result of that was they went back to their agencies, and there were three big things that I noticed: more financial support for deaf adult literacy. That project came into play, and there was a lot more backing behind that. There was one agency who typically would send out information, but now it was more about accommodations and access. They were more thoughtful about that and sending that information out. And then additionally, the agency that was providing the deaf mentor training, they were really getting going on that. Of course, COVID did put it on hold a bit, and they were still reaching out quite a bit, but that was a huge thing for us, a huge takeaway after that first event. We got so much more agency buy-in and support. The second big takeaway, in my opinion, in my experience, is that using deaf people as leaders. The second meeting we had was well attended, and we were able to get some responses from the NDC folks and reports and results. And it was broken down into 3 work groups. And we had our own team members come in and ask, hey, could you choose a deaf person to lead the working groups that we had established? Now, one of those groups that we had was all hearing people with the exception of one deaf person. And we thought, gosh, no, that's probably not going to work, may not be what we all expected. And so I stepped in and said, hey, let me kind of support you and help. And it was really hard for that deaf person to be the only deaf person in that group. Now we had a third meeting and we brought everybody back together again. And during that time, again, it was all hearing people and then myself and 2 deaf people. And we moved through the meeting, and about halfway through, one of our members said, hey, you're so quiet, to the deaf people. Hey, you want to speak up? And they said, I am absolutely overwhelmed. I'm outnumbered by far in this space. And it's like deaf people always feel isolated and alone. So to get them together and really encourage that support and raise them up as leaders was amazing, and something that we really learned. And then in the fourth meeting, it was more networking with deaf people, saying, hey, come on, everybody come. And then it was 25 deaf people and only 4 hearing people. The dynamics shifted in a huge way. People were very excited to take on leadership roles and projects. So to encourage the leadership amongst the deaf community and really raise those leaders up was absolutely incredible.
Definitely. I agree with you, Julie. It's critical who's in the room because that can make the difference depending on who's present. Anyone else? Kyle, Dominic, would you like to add? And this is Diego speaking. Julie, if you don't mind, I want to ask a follow-up question. What do you mean by empower? How does that benefit?
I mean, people who have decision making power and budgeting, fiscal power behind them, maybe educationally and community wise, but they're making the decisions. And how can they make a good decision if they're not really hanging out with us? They're not in our community or know what we need. So doing the EFC event, the Engage for Change event, really made that clear. And the decision tables, I say, if you're not at that table, how are you going to make the decision? And so we really need to break down those barriers and build a new table. Get rid of that old table and bring in a new one with a variety of community members, a lot of different deaf people, deaf disabled, deaf blind, deaf biopic people. Bring them in, get them to that table, have a new table for these new decisions that are coming that are really going to impact policy and procedure. It will definitely change. There are huge, long lasting ramifications if you talk to the deaf people in the first place.
And I'm curious, I have another follow-up question for anyone in the group. Do you, as you try to recruit people, those that are in those critical positions, do you indicate that you want them there at the table, but not to take over the space, that you want them there to lend an ear to the deaf community? How does that conversation go? Or what are the challenges inherent to that type of communication?
This is Kyle. I'm happy to answer that. When we recruited folks for the first EFC meeting, a lot of community members just, had some pushback. And we didn't know if it was because people tried repeatedly in the past and there was no results, very few successes. We had a lot of people kind of say, why? This is like the third or fourth time people reached out to me. Where's the action plan? Where's the takeaway? So there was a lot of talk, not a lot of action. So I feel like that was a lot of work that I had to do and really step in and say, hey, this is your chance. This is your opportunity. We're running it. Deaf people are the ones running it. Maybe it was a governmental organization or agency. Other people are hosting town halls or what have you, but often it was hearing people. Now this is your chance. This is led by deaf people. And that really got their attention. I felt like that was a huge takeaway for me that I saw, was that even convincing them to come, they were still like, well, let me see. We're going to test the water first. I don't really know what's going to happen. And then they started to warm up and open up. So to answer your question about the people who have the quote buy-in power, getting them to get there but not take over was super interesting for me, because there was a good balance of people who were kind of the higher ups in those agencies and who were also community members who were willing to come. Maybe it was Philly, maybe other communities, it just depends on where you all were hosting. But for me, I noticed there was a mutual agreement amongst members who was leading the way, who was leading. It was pretty good. In fact, I was shocked in some ways because I also think that it helps, that we kind of screened people who were going to come. We asked around to different members that were invited. We said, hey, can you invite a handful of folks to come with you? Because sometimes people who are on the core team, the deaf community is small, we know this, but at the same time it's really big and you don't always know everyone, and there are people who are overlooked who would come in and speak up if only they had that invitation. So I noticed that the dynamics there, before, during, and after, there were three different pieces of the dynamics, and all these people were coming in. It was a lot to process. It was a lot of information, and maybe we didn't notice as much later. Even you think back 2 months later and say, oh my gosh, it was this moment that impacted this. And darn it, I wish I could have capitalized on that moment in at the time. But sometimes it takes you a moment to digest, and the process is sometimes lengthy, but I think it's really important to have the process.
And this is Dominic. Also inviting the youth, the deaf youth. I was able to have folks from a deaf club, from junior NAD, be a part of my EFC event, and it was critical for them. And once others saw that example, and there was a heavy discussion on what we could do for our youth, and not only the youth, but the adults, but actually seeing them present, right? Typically, we're used to adults at community events, but seeing the youth present at the table, speaking to us about their journey, that was very powerful. This is Diego. I agree. It's great when we give deaf youth a platform to be able to share their experiences, their thoughts, and how they've had to navigate through the system. I think there are huge benefits to that. And Julie, I saw your hand up.
I think it's important that the meeting was very structured. There wasn't a lot of time to be able to switch gears. We had a panel, we had high school students, college students, a deaf MC, we had graduates, and then the tables, taking a look out there to make sure that everything was a nice mix and it wasn't really the same everywhere. And then the second round was another, like, once we kind of flipped around, and I think we still had a good mix, and I think the structure was very critical and helped us be able to have that mix. So that was really good.
And now I'll poll to our audience. We'd like to ask, do you feel deaf people are part of the decision-making process in your local community? The responses are yes, somewhat, no, or not sure. Okay, I'm not sure if we need a little more time to respond. Okay, responses are in. Let's see those responses. Wow, here are the results. 9% saying yes. That is a very low number. And then the next indicator is somewhat at 31%. Okay. And we see a clear no at 43%. 17% of the folks responded as not sure, but the highest number there is 43% with a no, somewhat coming right after that. Folks, thank you for your responses. This could be a surprise to some folks and not to others. It really depends your perspective and who you are. Panelists, I have a question for you next. Since the pandemic and major social movements that have occurred and have been happening in this very busy year, I'm curious, in what ways did community engagement for you change, and your local communities as well? I understand it's a loaded question. I will, maybe some of you can get us started with some examples. Dominic, this is Dominic responding. During the pandemic, when the pandemic first hit, well, just right before that, we had our second EFC meeting and it was reduced in size. The focus was solution based. We were looking for solutions. And I kept in touch with some of the other attendees. We were in conversation as to how to improve things. And first, we were wondering the where. Where shall we meet? Where's the funding for the meeting? And then data. There isn't much data in my area. There is national data, but not for Philadelphia with our specific needs in that area. And the pandemic stopped all that momentum. Now, we were still in touch, we were still in communication to try to come together and figure those logistics out. But the pandemic basically got in our way. This is Diego. NDC as well was impacted by the pandemic, Dominic. You're not the only one. We typically had many events throughout uh, the nation in many local communities. And in response to one of the questions, yes, in the local communities, we do have connections with deaf people in the community. We had those events hosted, but at the same time, when the pandemic struck, we had to stop travel. We had to avoid having these large events. So we had to put uh, that on hold. We had to figure out if it was going to become virtual, if things would change. And so we ourselves have had to strategize and figure out how to keep in touch with our community because folks everywhere have a lot of things going on, a lot of stress. They've got to survive. They've got to figure things out. Kids are now at home while parents are also working from home. So kids and parents are working and attending school in the same place. And so I'm curious if any of you had any personal experiences in that respect that you would like to share, positive, negative, regardless.
This is Kyle. Going back to the process of setting up EFC local for my particular community, I believe that, as Dominic said, the second EFC was right before the shutdown, and we planned to start the third. It was supposed to be in late spring, and we should have probably proceeded simply because at that point people hadn't yet been Zoom fatigued. They hadn't experienced that. Now people are just done. They're burnt out with technology and being on screens all day. And so I think that does have an impact as we move forward. Now, until we're able to go back in person next year, possibly, possibly not. I think following up on the community needs, like you said, everything kind of went sideways and was put on pause. And what the deaf community needs are sometimes pretty obvious in terms of communication access, education access, social access, etc. It's basically A to Z for us. But the problem is, how do we adapt that to our new normal? And the new normal is, do we keep on keeping on? Do we wait until later? Do we go back to whatever was, quote, normal before this? How has this impacted the community? Because the deaf community has such a rich culture and language and all of these things. And so basically we find ourselves at a fork in the road. Do we go this way or that? Do we reinvent something new? Do we come up with a third fork? No one has the answer to that yet. So I think we're all kind of in a holding pattern right now, and we are not sure where to invest our time and our energy, and we're kind of looking to each other to figure out how to do it properly with youth and adult, really all age groups, all demographics, what their needs are. The deaf community is one community that spans the spectrum. My needs may not be the same as another deaf person's needs, and how do we respond to that? We may both have the same
Mm-hmm.
thought, but we're going to navigate it differently to get there. I'm not a technical person at all.
Right.
So when I think about relying on technology for my deafness and my deaf communication, and I have no drive to do that. But other folks may be amazing with technology and say, oh my goodness, let me tell you how this goes. And like super easy for them to find that answer. And I think it's important we find the common denominator. And so it's a big part of my thought process currently.
Kyle, thank you. I appreciate your response. Julie, go ahead.
Wow, 2020, literally nothing is the same. So many things have gone differently. And I think, I've noticed that in most areas. And at our final meeting, we set up a Google spreadsheet with different organizations who'd be willing to provide a deaf role model. We had a lengthy list. There were 29 in total from all around. And so we have that. That's kind of the last thing we did. And I just took a look there. Still 29. We're still reaching out, trying to get others. But I've been in touch with the agencies who provide deaf mentor training, just checking in. And they say, oh, yes, we're still on board. But darn it, that COVID really got in our way. And so we'll send more messages and really just try to be in touch. But one thing that's been really cool, I think two people from the first meeting EFC, they've set up a group that are really excited to meet with legislatures and inviting people to the table and having different discussions in different areas, because they use the EFC local as a springboard to kind of see what we need in our community and then roll with it. It's been amazing to see that. And so, yeah, I mean, 2020, wow, just wow.
This is Diego speaking. I want to respond to two questions out of the Q&A. When we talk about the local communities, and again, I apologize if I haven't been clear. I want to be clear. NDC is partnered with local communities. Any communities that have a deaf community present, or any deaf community members, whether it be oral, signing, mainstream, deaf school oriented, regardless, we partner with a team from that local community, and we build up a community conversation project, and we provide support to that community team. For example, Julie worked with a community from Columbus, Ohio. Kyle and Dom have worked in I shouldn't say used to or have, but still are in the Philadelphia area. I hope that clears it up for our audience. Fantastic question. And let's see if we can define this. What are some tips and suggestions that a national organization that is involved with the deaf community, like RID or NAD, can use to reflect the importance of including deaf people in the decision-making process while creating policy and decisions within their own organizations? Any tips or suggestions, panel? That's a good question, too.
This is Julie. It's a great question. One tip, I think, is at the very beginning. Don't get along in your process and then be like, oh, hey, wait, we should probably invite somebody. I say from the get go, we've got to have representation for everyone in the community. The deaf community is so diverse. Deaf, disabled, deaf, blind, biopic members of those communities also need to be at the table and take a look at privilege, education, language, race, everything. Take a good hard look at that and then go into collaboration and really have a good, honest conversation and support each other. I think that's key. This is Kyle. I'd like to reinforce everything Julie said. It's so important to have representation from each part of our community, and it's so important that organizations and agencies don't say you don't aren't so careful. They like fall into this trap of having someone there just for the sake of having someone there. Very important to avoid that. It's so easy, such an easy trap to find yourself in. So be very mindful of when you select a person to come in, because you want them to have a voice at the table. You want them to be involved, not just a token deaf person at the table. That is the number one thing to be mindful of as you move forward. So I'd like to leave you with that for sure.
Kyle, thank you for that as well. Any other comments? Dominic says, I second what Kyle just said. Thank you. Diego says, okay, Dom, thank you. And that's a great segue to our next question. Panelists, the next question says, quite often decisions are made without deaf people being a part of the process when it's about their issues and experiences. What does centering deaf people in systemic change mean to you? And what does that look like? How does it manifest? People have different definitions of this. I'm curious what yours are.
This is Kyle. I think with systemic change, people often approach it in two different ways. One is from the top down, and the other would then be from the bottom up. Community members tend to work from the bottom up and rise in that way to reach their goals. And sometimes they get lucky. People at the top are mindful and understanding and they invest. Other times it's full blown war and they have to work really diligently to get to their goals. So they're opposing approaches, but hopefully both, it's like, can we meet in the middle and work from there? Do we work from the bottom up, from the top down? I think that's part of the process of identifying community members, identifying the needs, and then oftentimes many people who are interested in systemic change, we know what we want, we know what we need, but we're not sure how to get there. And then when we have a lot of people at the table, then that can often cause confusion as well, and sometimes some tension. And it's difficult to define it clearly in terms of couching it with what the needs are or what the change could or should be. And it doesn't happen overnight. I know people feel like, let's get cracking, let's do it now. It doesn't matter, let's just move on it. But really, what happens there really needs to set the foundation for everything moving forward. If there's no foundation, then later on, if something happens, it's really easy for the whole thing to fall apart. And, we should expect ups and downs and changes, but a good foundation is key for what comes later, for resources and knowledge. And when you have the sense that it's time for something to change and something to come up. Now, I'm not going to guarantee that this will happen, but it's so important with systemic change to keep these things in mind. Identify what the system is, what the process it is itself. And I think that that's where many of us, including myself included, it's a gap, and we miss that often.
Kyle, that is very critical that you mentioned. We do have to understand how the system works. That's an important component of building those foundations. And who would know best? Deaf individuals, deaf folks. Dominic here agreed. And Diego says, anyone would like to expand or add?
This is Julie. To add to what Kyle said, we need to be listening, we need to be heard. Deaf people are left in the dark for so long. It's time, and people want to be heard. It's time to express ourselves, and the time is now. And then you can move forward with the change and make that systemic changes. But first, people need to be heard, because system change, again, you have to include deaf people from the beginning. Making a systemic change and then including a deaf person later on down the line is not, they don't feel relevant, they don't feel supported, they're not included. But once they're in from the beginning, the system will continue that change because it's part of our shared experience. It's part of what we need, and we feel engaged.
This is Dominic speaking. Oftentimes, the deaf community do work at a deaf organization, a nonprofit, say, for example, who provides resources, and then those resources are shared. And that's one way that we can impact change. Sometimes there just isn't enough information that exists out there, and there are barriers. It's not something that can be taken care of or resolved overnight, but there is information that must be shared with the community. And as we keep an eye on that, that will induce change.
This is Kyle. I think with systemic change, we all need to be knowledgeable, not just ourselves, but the community at large. And also not focusing solely on the results. We also need to focus on the process as well. We're all looking to the goal and the end result. That's the most obvious thing that we want to see, right? The program established and we're good to go. It's what it takes to get there that we need to take a look at. And often that's what it's forgotten. It's not measured in those short steps along the way. But the long-term goal needs to be reflective of the community. And so that's where I really think long and hard about it. Is systemic change, what does it look like? Yes, but how do we make the system part of the system, right? So it's kind of, because so to define what the system is, we have to define who the people are, the person is, person or persons. And so different groups have different definitions for the same exact thing. So we've got to clarify that on the outset of the project.
I do agree with that, Kyle. And another component is also self awareness and understanding what that means and how that benefits systemic change. When a community can come together, that self analysis, that self knowledge. What are your takes on that, Julie?
Yeah, one of the projects that we worked on in Ohio was developing a CDI training to get more deaf interpreters. We played the committee, everybody was white, the planning commission, the trainer finally came to me. It was a person of color who also worked with a white person, but they were then able to be more mindful of us to take a look at ourselves. We're like, hey, we need more representation. And it's great, but you can't just check that little box off and say, well, we're represented. It's an ongoing, engaging process. The community will only be stronger for it. So training and getting out there and asking people, hey, do you want to be an interpreter? Get in here, person of color, we need you. We want to train these people and get them more involved. And so I think that for me, bringing in better and more diverse representation in what we're doing, any project we do, is very, very important.
And this is Diego speaking. I have two great questions from the Q&A. And the question says, Kyle, you mentioned avoiding tokenism. How can an organization know if they're actually engaging communities in a meaningful way and not tokenism? Is there a way to measure that? Are there any metrics to understand that dynamic?
This is Kyle. Wow, what a great question with a really difficult answer. Sometimes, you just go with your gut. It's hard to describe. Obviously, an organization or agency, if they're like, oh goodness, we have a situation come up, we only have a white person, let me look and find this person of color. Hey, could you come in and do this? Because I want you to tell them. I don't want to tell them. That's very blatantly tokenism. If that person has their own assessment of the situation and then the person speaks on their own, that would then be bringing them to the table and not the token. So it's a hard line to walk, and each person's going to have to gauge that. It's a judgment call. But some are more blatant or more obvious than others. And so I think it's something to take a look at for yourself. And again, for me,
Right.
it might look like tokenism, but not to another person. So that's a really difficult question to answer, but thank you.
I'd have to say that is a tough question for sure. For myself, when I want someone at the table, I understand, for me at least, it's because they're an expert. There's someone who can make decisions, there's someone who can provide guidance, someone who's been already taking the lead. And so sometimes it's done because there's a need to check off a quota, and that's blatant and obvious tokenism. Tokenism can take on many forms within many different contexts and situations. But the key thing is coming back to the reason. Why did we bring in this person? Is it because of their experience and capabilities, or just because who they are on the surface? There is another question that's come in from Greg. And Greg says, how do you work with state agencies that provide deaf services that does not include deaf folks or the deaf community in their decision making?
This is Julie. I would
Mm-hmm.
start with going to their events, interacting with their folks, building rapport, and then being invited to their meetings, getting in that space, and then working with the agency. And then the agency will recognize how to better serve the deaf community. But you've got to have that relationship. That piece is key.
And this is Diego. Let me clarify, Julie, when you say agencies, agencies should attend deaf events and learn from the deaf community, or can you tease that out just a bit more?
What I meant was if an agency is hosting an event, then deaf people go and attend those events and then cultivate those relationships at their events.
And that's a great comment. And I want to follow up rather quickly with that. I often get a lot of comments indicating that the deaf community has been invited, but no one shows. That's heard quite often. How do we break that barrier down? And this is Dom talking about a state agency providing deaf services without having any deaf people in the decision making process. I think quite often, like for myself, I'm a board member of a deaf organization, and we notice policy issues by receiving complaints through the deaf community or deaf services. We'll make a complaint, and then we follow up with that state agency to figure out the reason for the complaint. And that's the typical process. And then once that has happened, it opens up doors for us where we are invited. So it's key for deaf individuals to make those complaints. And you had another part of your question, Diego. Diego says, yes, people that work at state agencies often make the invitation to the deaf community for the beginning of a project or for a dialogue, and quite often they're left empty-handed with no community members showing up. How can that be fixed? And this is Kyle, why don't you take that for me?
Sure. In my experience in working with state organizations and state agencies, even at the federal level, I notice if you go up to people kind of just off the cuff and talk about what needs to be talked about right then, there's a lot of resistance. So, like Julie said, developing rapport is key, really engaging and taking time to develop those relationships, find some common ground. And then when the time feels right, you can kind of slowly transition into that hotter topic because people often feel threatened if it's kind of in their face and not the most timely of events. But Yeah, and then also people in the government agencies have to follow this process, and often it's not even because of the person themselves, it's the system itself, and they have to follow this specific pattern and their system. And we could use the system to our benefit to create that change. And I, god goodness, I use the word system quite a bit, don't I?
Not just yourself, Kyle, we all have to. But I think that was a fantastic question. And please, audience members, we would love to respond to your questions. Ask away. I do have a fourth question, and I'd like to ask that now. Since the pandemic hit, how has your community been impacted? Your community work? Any pros and cons, positive or negative impacts? And I'd like to talk about uh, seeing an increase in the positive impacts. We understand the negative impacts, the lack of ability, and all that. Did you have any of that where maybe you were disconnected? And how did you deal with that? What common challenges or barriers came up? And with all the guidelines from the CDC and all the restrictions, what are your thoughts into how you navigate that?
This is Julie. Like I mentioned, there were two people from the first meeting that really took the ball and ran with it. They were on Zoom and meeting, and I think we became more tech savvy over time. So we're able to share information via Google Drive and spreadsheets. And they identified 8 different areas, and we're really brainstorming, and that work has continued. So that's been great. Now, access is there for people, even who don't sign or who use spoken English. They have access to it. So I think that's been really great. And that work is not really directly related to the EFC work, but it was a catalyst and it's done really, really well. So EFC has really built more deaf leaders along the way, and that's been really great.
And this is Dom responding. I remember the first event that was hosted, the EFC event in Philadelphia. And at the second event, everyone had warmed up. The first one served like an icebreaker, and the second one, people were looking forward to it. And people called it somewhat of a happy hour, but it wasn't happy hour. It was actual discussion, dialogue, data collection, like I mentioned, and a search for resources. And that was the part where folks who came felt comfortable in that conversation and dialogue. Of course, with the pandemic, there was a lot of questions about logistics, and we understood we weren't going to meet in person. We were going to go virtual. I think we were working on setting up the third meet, but folks didn't want to do a virtual meet. They became afraid of losing something in that change. Of course, deaf folks, we are visual. We love meeting in person. We're also sensory, so we have to have that live experience, right, Diego? And this is Diego, right? Zoom has, well, really surprised me. I have spent up to 5 hours, right? So Zoom fatigue is real. And I could just imagine people thinking about being engaged in a community conversation via Zoom, along with everything else that is already via Zoom. That's very fatiguing. A lot of energy that has to be put into that, a lot of attention that has to be given. And so that is part of the dynamic that is going on. Panelist, anyone else? Do you have any more responses?
This is Kyle. I would speak a little more broadly, just not about EFC, but more of the deaf community at large and access to communication during the pandemic. It has been nice to finally be able to see more and more interpreters on TV during press conferences and different things that are hosted live. And on a broad level has been great, not so much localized, but on a larger scale and in social opportunities and educational opportunities because of the computers. It's a double-edged sword. Computers hurt and help us. So I'm not going to go back to the system, or I will go back to the system, but if we understand how to use it, it feels easy, right? Or easier anyway for most folks. But if we just
Mm-hmm.
throw some stuff, it's like sink or swim trying to figure out how to use it. If there's no
Right.
transition time and the process time is not there, there's no support in terms of the transition to get back to life as normal as possible for deaf people in the deaf community. We already have so many gaps with interpreters and education, and just it runs the gamut. So it makes this doubly or triply more difficult than it has to be. We spend more time and energy focusing on solving this problem than we can get to actually where we need to be in solving situations that we need to address on a larger scale. And by the time we get there, we're just exhausted, and we've run out of bandwidth because it's so much more work to get to that space. And it's like, do we have the resources to solve the problem? I can't answer that. In fact, I'm not sure. And it's a shame. It's a shame.
And this is Diego. I do have a question for you, panelists. Katie asks if there's any advice for hearing people that want to become a good ally. Uh,
This is Julie. And I would say, listen to the deaf community, listen to what they have to say, support them, don't take over. Support, learn about the community, about those folks. I mean, that is absolutely priority. I will leave you with that word, listen. This is Kyle.
Listen, got that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, listen and always ask, because the more questions you ask, the more interactive the
Hmm.
conversation is, and the less misunderstandings and miscommunications occur, and the process will be so much more smooth.
Agreed. Dominic, this is Dominic. Again, it's important to listen. Ask and listen. Ask the deaf community. Ask deaf people their frustrations and their experiences, and then just listen. Right? We're not looking for a response. It's just for you to listen. This is Diego. I've noticed that when people listen, they try to solve the issue, but what we're asking is just to hear us out. How can you support, right? And people look for a solution right away, but we're asking for you to stand back and just take a time to take that in and put some thoughts together. And my goodness, we have very few minutes left. I think we can respond to one more question from the audience. And so if anyone has experience, have you worked with the deafblind community accessing services? Now, with the social distancing limitations, uh, are they struggling to locate resources? So here's a question in regards to deafblind. Dominic, I'll respond to this in a general fashion. The challenge right now are SSPs for deafblind individuals. Funds for SSPs are reduced and difficult to locate. We keep fighting to find funding sources and continue those funding sources for SSP providers. And we are struggling, of course, with the social distancing issue to find support for deaf individuals that live on their own to be able to provide them that support. This is an ongoing issue. As the end of the month, right, we are approaching December. Funds will run out. Kyle, will you remind me, are the funds running out in December? So we're looking for a continuation so that we can continue those programs. Thank you, Kyle, supporting our deaf-blind individuals.
This is Kyle. This is a very interesting dilemma. So, how we classify people, doctors, nurses, people who interact, personal care assistants, are considered essential workers. There is no clear definition of what an SSP is. Are they non essential? Are they essential? And the definition has been shifting and changing over time. And so some weeks they allow SSPs, and others they say, "Oh, nope, you're not allowed to be there. It's against the law. Well, we're gonna break protocol." There's no clear definition of that, and so I think that's part of the challenge for deafblind community right now. Personally, I don't have a lot of experience, but I have heard from someone who knows someone, and goodness, they are often left out, and they're part of our community, but at the same time, we leave them out regularly. And so deaf-blind people are so important to our community. They have an important voice, but they have no input, and that needs to change. And so we know it's best to include them, but then we don't reach out to them. They've got to be brought in and reached out to so they're included. Now, the question is how, and each community is different, and we know this.
This is Diego. Thank you, Kyle. Now, before we wrap things up, don't leave yet. We do have some resources that we'd like to share with you. But first, panelists, I'm curious if any of you have any final remarks, last thoughts to share. I think we've said it all with our dialogue already. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. So we will go ahead and wrap up today's event. Folks, before you leave, I want to extend our gratitude for being a part of this conversation today, for hearing about how to center deaf people in your communities and practices. We have plenty of resources at ndc.org. deaf.org/local. On that page, you can learn more about affecting local change. We also just published and released from the American Annals from the Deaf an article written by Dr. Lou Carbialago, which is a long article, and there is a summary in our website resources called 8 Strategies for Deaf People to Enact Systemic Change. And both are in English PDF format as well as American Sign Language. And you can find those on our website. We will have more resources coming out in the new year, as well as e-learning courses. So we encourage you folks, if you are new or would like a refresher, to take Deaf 101. You can also take the 2 new e-learning courses early in the new year, which is coming soon, that focus on deaf-centered practices and engaging the deaf community, engaging the deaf community 101. Folks, thank you so much again for your time. Feel free to reach out to our help desk if you have any more questions. We will be emailing you a follow-up, and please feel free to respond with your feedback, to respond with questions if you would need more support. Thank you, everyone, so much, and have a wonderful day.